My name is Jeff Tucker. I'm the editor of Mises.org. I'm sitting here today with the compiler and general editor of the Bastiat collection, which is the first collection of all of Bastiat's translated writings to ever appear. And it was published by the Mises Institute, arrived in our office a couple of days ago. And the compiler and editor and the person who introduces the book is Professor Mark Thornton. And he's with us here today. Welcome, Mark.
It's great to be with you here today. It's a very exciting project. As you said, it is the first complete collection of the translations of Bastiat, and it's really an amazing collection. It's really, not only is it the first thing you should read in economics, but it's really the last thing you need to read in economics for the average person because it contains everything. Bastiat, on the very first page, turns the reader into an economist and then takes that reader through the entire book, through economic policy, through economic theory, and so you really get the complete picture. It's really just a wonderful collection.
The way you talk about Bastiat, it's almost like he's a colleague of yours, but actually he lived long ago, didn't he?
Oh, yes. Early part of the 19th century. I feel like, I'm not sure if colleague is the right word, because Bastiat was a person who is in a category beyond everything else. He's just a fantastic economist, a fantastic writer. Everybody agrees about that. And just a fantastic man. Yeah,
filled with passion.
Absolutely. The man, it was the embodiment of passion. He spent, he only lived less than 50 years, and he spent the last few years of his life involved in politics and involved in this tremendous writing project. And you can see the passion coming through in his essays. You can see sometimes his anger, and you can see his passion, and you can see his brilliance in every single essay.
Yeah. Now, we were talking earlier that it also turns out to be, oddly, the first collection of his writings that has an index in it.
That's right.
Kind of peculiar.
That's right. Bastiat is, his translations appear in various forms, but they don't have, the completeness or the indexing, which is so useful for researchers and students to be able to fully use the project.
Well, I guess this is the real thing. It's not just a prop here, so we'll pick it up and show it. And here's Volume 1 and Volume 2. These are massive volumes, but helpfully divided into two parts. So what was your thought when you first saw them? There's a time lag between the end of your hard labors, which lasted a little more than a year, and really it's a culmination of a lifetime of research into Bastiat. What was your first thought when you saw these books?
Well, it's beautiful. It's majestic. My part of the project was pure pleasure. To stumble across these translations, the earlier English translations, and to find that we had not only all of, copies of all of the existing translations, but even more material. Right. And the key material I'd like to talk about at some point, but, my part was pure pleasure. A lot of other people worked on this in terms of doing the index and the production. It's all very magnificent. And plus, I'd like to thank the donors who made it all possible, because it was a resource-intensive project.
Yes. Now, generally, the translations of Bastiat began into English not too long after his death, right?
That's correct. The translations done by Patrick Stirling took place in the 1860s. There were other translations that came out during the 1860s and 1870s.
Yeah. And these were, and Stirling was, am I right, an English liberal?
Scottish.
Scottish.
Yes.
And the generation following the great anti-mercantilist English tradition. And so he knew people who knew Bastiat, right?
That's correct. And it's kind of strange. I'm not sure how you can understand this, but all of the translators of Bastiat were either Scottish or had Scottish surnames in the United States, which is a kind of unusual connection between France and Scotland.
Did Bastiat actually go to Scotland at some point, or did he visit?
Not that I know of. He did correspond, and I believe he did meet Cobden and Bright, and was influenced by the anti-Corn Law League and their drive for free trade and their success, actually, in getting free trade legislation passed. He was very much inspired by their efforts.
Yeah. So in this collection, we've got, of course, the law, what is seen and unseen. These are, I guess, his two most famous essays?
I believe so. Those are the things that I read as a college student, and those were the things that were most readily available, and I think they're probably, some of the most important of Bastiat's essays. But we start with what is seen and unseen and all of the essays there, and then we go into the institutions of government, of property, of law, and what is money. And that was the essay that was lost. And I just happened to be working out of an older edition of Bastiat's essays and recognized that this essay on money had not appeared in the modern American translations anywhere. And so I seized on that opportunity and wrote an essay about it, and we republished it in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics in 2002. And it's really very important. Everybody said that Bastiat didn't say anything about money, and he didn't write anything about money, and that's a sort of a missing gap in Bastiat's thinking. Even Hayek says that Bastiat tried to justify why Bastiat somehow didn't write on money, and he has an absolutely brilliant essay on money. And it's not just what is money, because he wanted to disabuse people the idea that that money is wealth. He wanted people to understand that money was a medium of exchange, which was important, but that you couldn't make society wealthier by bringing in more money. So in this essay, he ties together the relationship of money to protectionism and shows how protectionism is self-defeating, it doesn't work, and then he even goes on to exploit this topic and shows how that's also related to war. So he takes us all the way up through protectionism and how that leads to war, perpetual war, and so he basically uncovers the whole Austrian viewpoint on this whole subject.
And there is a separate essay on war, isn't there?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we go beyond that to economic sophisms and protectionism, and also economic harmonies, where he really starts to lay out his whole theoretical framework.
And that gets us into Volume 2, Economic Harmonies is the bulk of Volume 2.
Yeah, it comes in Volume 2.
Did you say something in the introduction about how Economic Harmonies is, you have a high regard for it, but it also caused his reputation as an economist to suffer to some extent. What's going on with that?
That's true. Bastiat wrote Economic Harmonies in the last months of his life. And it is considered incomplete, or at least, Bastiat wasn't the actually publishing author in the sense that he was already dead by the time it came out. So, there's that issue, and then also Bastiat is attacked by even his friends for having a funny theory of value and things of that nature. And actually, if you go back and look at Bastiat's work, which I've had to do, of course, you find that there's no way that those interpretations can hold up, because everything he says about value, of course, makes good sense. And so it's a misreading of Bastiat to say that he had an intrinsic theory of value. It just doesn't make any sense. And so that interpretation doesn't hold water, and Professor Holzman has gone into great detail showing that those earlier criticisms of Bastiat as a theorist were wrong.
So you're of the school, as is Professor Holzman and a few others, you're of the view that Bastiat is not just a great polemicist and not just a great writer and popularizer with a burning passion for liberty, but a very good economist who made important contributions.
Absolutely. I mean, I consider him an Austrian economist, and I've written to that extent, and Professor Holzman has shown that he was a real contributing economic theorist. And one of the things you'll see if you read this collection, or when you read this collection, is the consistency. That as you go through the beginnings of his writings and the polemical stuff all the way through the theory, you see a grand consistency which can only be generated from somebody who has a strong theoretical superstructure. And so when you look at the actual aspects of theory, you see fine economic theory, but you also see this consistency in his writings that indicates that he does have that strong theoretical superstructure working from day one all the way through to the end of his life.
Yeah. And this really comes out in, well, I guess what is seen and unseen, which is in some ways, I suppose, but I just love that essay. I think it's just a kick.
That's what I said, in the page one, he turns you into an economist.
Right.
And once you read that, you can't ignore that ever. And I think it not only does that to you, it draws you in to the rest of the collection.
Yeah. And then in Economic Harmonies, he's just overwhelmed with this, with the desire to convey to the readers this idea of a liberal society, that it can work without government coercion. And it seems like in his time, this insight was missing, and it's certainly missing in our times.
Oh yes, I mean, and it's so critical. Bastiat painstakingly takes the reader through and shows how the interests of various groups in society are in harmony.
Okay, yeah.
So that the borrower and the lender both really want each other to do very well. They're not really trying to exploit each other. The lender wants the borrower to be prosperous so that they can pay back the loans and take out other loans. And so, both sides really want each other to thrive. They want each other to prosper. And that's true of all sorts of interactions within society. And it's very important for people to understand that, as you say, in his time and in our time, I think we're taught in the public schools, for whatever reason, that our interests are in conflict. Yeah, and so everybody feels like they're being put upon by others, by Walmart and McDonald's and corporations and interest groups, right on down the line, when actually the basic elements of society are or need to be in harmony. We want each other to do well, so that we do well as a result. And so Bastiat goes through and describes all these types of interactions to show that we really should think of ourselves as a harmonious society rather than a society of conflict and envy and distrust.
And he goes even further, doesn't he, to say that intervention itself creates forms of social conflict.
Oh yes, right throughout the entire collection, government intervention causes all sorts of problems, and he's very detailed, I mean, in a very nice way, in showing, what inflation does to the economy and why it doesn't help anybody and how it creates injustice. And so he gives you all of the elements of why government intervention is a bad thing, and he does so across society. So it doesn't matter what the government is doing, it's creating economic problems, there's no justification, and it creates injustice.
Yeah. Well, that last point is an interesting one. Do you think to some extent that Bastiat's reputation has suffered because he was such a strong, well, I don't want to say moralist, but he wrote a lot about the morality of freedom.
That's right. And I don't think that there should be anything wrong with that.
Yeah.
Every scientist, every economist has their own point of view. The nice thing about Bastiat is he justifies his position and he wears it on his sleeve. He's not trying to hide his point of view in all of this like a typical economist would do today. And so you get to know Bastiat the man. You get to feel his passion when you're reading this. And you're free to disagree with him, I'm sure. And if he was alive today, I imagine he'd be willing to debate you. And I'm sure you would have no chance of defending your own position against Bastiat himself.
You conjure such an image of him in his last days trying to frantically finish this Economic Harmonies. What is it that drove him? I mean, he never stopped working. And you almost get a sense of panic, that he was panicked about his own mortality because he wouldn't have enough time to convince all living people of the case for liberty.
It's truly amazing. You're talking about such a short window of time. And you're talking about somebody who's not just writing economics. You're talking about somebody who's actively engaged in the government of France. And so, I don't know how he did it. of course, now he did spend most of his life learning before he began writing. He was a reader and a debater for most of his life, and so once he started, he was already prepared. You get the sense that everything that he did had been thought through long in advance.
Yeah.
These were not things that he just sat down and said, "Okay, what do we think about international trade?" These are things that he'd spent his life accumulating the knowledge and the insight, and then it goes down on paper at the very end. And of course, he died very young of tuberculosis. In the last couple of years of his life, he had difficulty speaking, and indeed, some of his writings were written down as arguments to be presented in Parliament to the legislature, because he couldn't himself speak them in public.
And is that what accounts to some extent for some of the rhetorical apparatus of the book, where you feel like, you know, he's just sort of grabbed you by the collar, you know, and he's, you know, holding you and trying to explain things to you with a great deal of passion.
Absolutely, and he uses dialogue, which of course is completely out of style nowadays, but Galileo used it, so I guess it can't be that bad, you know, to lay down his founding principles. So, you know, Bastiat uses that in many devices like that to great effect. I mean, because it's all very personalized when you have Bastiat on one side and then, you know, the average Joe on the other, and you know, you really feel the personality of Bastiat in that one character, and you can understand and sympathize with the other person who doesn't want to hear about economics, you know, don't give me that, but hangs in there long enough to get an understanding. And so it's really a luscious, vibrant approach to economics.
Now, tell me about this essay. You were mentioning a story earlier that you had concerning this one essay that you're particularly interested in. This one on money.
Yes, what is money? That's really one of the standout, most important things in the collection, I think, because it's been brought back into life after so long. And I found this essay, and I was invited to a conference on Bastiat in Atlanta to celebrate Bastiat's anniversary in 1999. And so I go there, and I find out that Robert McTeer, the president of the Dallas Fed, is also going to be speaking on Bastiat. And so when I get there, I introduce myself to McTeer, and he asked me, what am I going to be speaking about? And I said, well, this essay I found on what is money. And he just gave himself the big hit in the head and said, well, I had found that and had it translated, but when I found out what was in it, I decided to shelve the whole thing.
McTeer's good on all aspects of markets except for the money question, right?
Right. And Bastiat points out in the essay that, you know, money is so important that you have to understand that, or then you get protectionism and war, taxation, and so on and so forth, bureaucracy. And so without Bastiat's views of money, everything else falls apart. Yeah. And so it's very, very important. And it was interesting, you know, McTeer was scheduled to speak at this event, and when he found out that I was going to be talking about money, the program was changed, and he gave opening remarks and then left the conference. And I saw him in the background behind the planters while I was giving my talk, but as soon as I sat down, he was gone. Yeah, he was gone. And so he just took off. Yeah. And Bastiat's views on money, of course, you know, hit directly at something like the Fed, central banks, and what they're doing, and how they're, you know, trying to dollarize all these other economies, and how they're using it to, you know, fight foreign wars and do all this nonsense. Well, Bastiat had all of that down in his essay on what is money.
And it was probably true in his day too, right? This was a topic that he was not supposed to discuss.
Right. And so that, you know, that makes me wonder, why was this essay essentially translated and then lost? Yeah. David Wells put it in his edition in 1877, and Wells was an advocate of the gold standard, you know, but since then, everything else that's come out about Bastiat since then, and there's been editions throughout the years, what is money mysteriously was not in there. Yeah. And it's the key essay.
Yeah. Yeah. And, of course, Bastiat himself, being a Frenchman, had seen what inflation does to society. In the case of France, there's the uproar of the calamity of the after effects of the French Revolution.
Absolutely. He knew. And then, of course, at the end, the worst thing of all is paper money.
Yeah.
So, he understood the effects of inflation. He disabuses the reader of this helicopter theory of inflation. He says, well, if we did that and it actually happened to turn out that nothing actually changed, what would we do? We sit around and laugh at each other. Well, unfortunately, it's not a very funny thing, inflation in the real world. It's really disastrous, and Bastiat brings all of this out onto the table.
Now, we have lots of French students coming through here, and invariably they report, well, not only a devotion to Bastiat, but also that their introduction to Bastiat came about through exposure through English-speaking economists and not exposure in their French education.
Mm-hmm. Well, the French liberal school has been completely trashed in France and throughout the world. And, Bastiat, very similar, is lumped together with that group as not being scientific and not being theoretically rigorous. Just so happens they're correct. I mean, that's sort of the key issue, is you want to be correct. And so, he's been taken out of the curriculum. He's been taken out of the standard reading, but now in Bastiat's lifetime and shortly thereafter, he was very influential in the United States. He was very influential in Europe, Sweden.
Now, you mean even in the late 19th century in the United States?
Yes, yes. I mean, I think his influence, took off in the 1860s.
Yeah.
But then, of course, it began to wane, and you get more socialist points of view and that sort of thing. But after his death, he was very influential throughout Europe and the United States, and it was very prominent.
Something I wanted to mention again on this whole What is Money essay. I remember at the time you were very excited. I was busy doing something else. You kept sort of coming in day after day going on about this What is Money. And do you think we can put it out in a book? Do you think we can put it out and publish it in an essay? And I was thinking, this is just not going to happen. Yeah, this is not.
Well, that was my original intent. I did the essay on was Bastiat an Austrian economist, and then What is Money and Bastiat's views on money. And then I thought we really need to get that part about money out into general circulation. And, of course, I wanted to send a copy to President McTeer as well in Dallas. But to get that out into wider circulation so there'd be a nice, easy reading little monograph. But then...
Now we've got the full...
Well, then the problem of Bastiat wasn't available at all.
That's right.
So it wasn't just some missing pieces coming to light. It was the whole series of translations were simply not available, and that's really something that can't really be tolerated. We can't allow Bastiat to go out of favor like he did at the end of the 19th century. It's something, and that's really what I love about this, is that this project, it needs to be out there. It needs to be continuously out there for the end of time, basically. And so I'm really glad that
So now students who can have access to these works, and of course we've got them, both of them, published the same day online in PDFs. So people can go to them, and they're thoroughly bookmarked, so you can go through and read the books. And so now there's no excuses left. You have to now you can get Bastiat
for free.
For free, right. And if you want to carry it around with you, you're welcome to do that. And we priced them absurdly low, especially given how beautiful they are. And aren't you pleased with the bindings and the look of them?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I remember, you told me how much they were, and I said, for both of them?
Yeah.
But it's really great, and having the PDF available so that people in lower income countries and faraway places where it's so expensive to transport and postage, India and China and places like that, that they can have access to those volumes immediately, I think is a great thing.
And, I don't know if you've had this experience, but I quite often, I'm reading a book at home, and then I come to the office, and whoops, I left the book at home. And I wanted to quote something from it or cite something from it. Well, it's right there then online. I don't even have to go across the room or buy another edition or whatever. Or same thing with going on vacation. So they kind of work together, the hard copy and the online editions.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think you always want to see a book before you buy it.
Yeah.
In the age of online books, though, that's really not possible unless you make the PDF available. Then you can open it up, you can look at the table of contents. You might just be looking for one thing and want to look in the index and find out did Bastiat write anything about Proudhon.
Yeah.
Well, there's never been an index before, so that's another addition. So you can, and so you go to Proudhon and you find out exactly where Bastiat dealt with him, or Montesquieu.
Yeah,
or anything like that.
Right.
And all these previous editions in American translations didn't have really a good research type book available to you.
And it underscores just how well read he was and engaged in the debates of his time.
Oh, yeah.
Which I have to say surprised me a little bit. Reading through it, I was amazed at how he engaged all the debates of his time, naming thinkers by name and quoting them at length, and then just tearing them apart very aggressively and artfully.
Right, and it also, either reading through it or looking at the index, you can tell what Bastiat had read.
Yeah.
And you see he reads Montesquieu and Fenelon, and then picks out certain things where they got it wrong.
Yeah.
And so he's, in this earlier stages of his career, he was debating the greats of all time in his mind. He was reading them and either agreeing with them or disagreeing with them, and then bringing that forward into some of these essays. So you can tell where his influences come from.
Isn't there something also uncanny about reading Bastiat and seeing just how directly all the issues that he addresses pertain to the world in which we live right now? The same issues. Public schooling, protection, war, democracy, inflation. And
he gets it right.
Yeah, and gets it. Yeah, and just nails it. I suppose reading Bastiat and discovering just how similar the issues were in his time as compared to our time can have one of two effects. I mean, I suppose it could drive you to a kind of despair. Well, look at this. The same stupid issues, plagued Bastiat's day as ours. What's the point? On the other hand, it can have the opposite effect and make you feel as if, I'm part of something larger than my own generation. I'm part of this larger tradition of thought that we're always having to fight the good fight again and again in every generation.
Yeah, it's hard for me to believe somebody coming away as a pessimist after reading Bastiat, but I understand the point. But I think that the passion that Bastiat is always is going to create an optimist, not a pessimist. And I think that tradition and that linkage back in time from the Austrian school back to Bastiat, and seeing that lineage, that continuity, I think is really fabulous. And I think that anybody, no matter what their particular issue it is, if it's pro-gold standard or homeschooling or whatever it is, you're going to find a friend in Frederick Bastiat.
What is the linkage between the Austrian tradition and the French liberal school? Can you trace that out? Just
well, it's
short.
There is a consistent pattern there between the French liberals and the modern Austrians, and it really goes back to Cantillon, to Turgot, to the physiocrats, even Adam Smith and Hume, right up on through the French liberals, Say, and so on, Condillac, and then Bastiat, and so there's a long tradition of classical liberalism and freedom and all the rest in free market economics that goes back from 1730 on up to 1850 and even beyond. But of course, as Professor Salerno has shown in one of his great essays, that there was a systematic attack on the French school by the British and by the domestic French economics profession, which was under government control,
Right.
and basically discarded all the French liberal economists and replaced them with bureaucratic lawyers. And so, I mean, there was a systematic destruction of the French liberal school after Bastiat. It's a fairly quick decline. You have the British economists, saying that the French are no good, and then you have the French themselves institutionalizing a pro-government type of bureaucratic economist, while the French liberals lose their institutional base, and so that's really the reason why you see that decline in the late 19th century.
Right. Well, that's a very interesting point, because it underscores the need for institutions to kind of counteract that, institutions like the Mises Institute to counteract that sort of cartelization of ideas. So in many ways, the publication of this it's sort of like a revolutionary act.
Yeah. Well, if the Institute wasn't here, then this collection is not going to be here.
Yeah.
My essay wouldn't have been published. It was published in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, and so you basically see Bastiat disappearing.
Yeah.
Which is would be a tragedy.
Yeah. Well, we can look forward to better days then.
Absolutely.
Thank you for all your wonderful work on this collection, and
my
for
pleasure.
joining me today.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you.